Well, hello there and welcome back to Marcelian Online, and today we have a very important topic to discuss because they've admitted it. Now, Blizzard finally has said that Mythic Plus is not fun. They know why it's not fun and they don't like it that it's not fun, and that will change in 11.1 or so they say in a recent interview with PC Gamer. So what exactly are we talking about, and is Mythic Plus fun, or it will continue the doom of dungeons and players? Ion Hazzikostas has been interviewed by PC Gamer just recently, and a couple of topics have been addressed and pulled up for discussion when it comes to Mythic Plus and what has happened in the first season of The War Within versus what the devs kind of hoped it would happen. Most of all, and probably the most important thing, is that Ion has actually said that the dungeons not being fun is definitely a problem that they're looking towards. We already know that probably the main issue is that players don't play Mythic Plus right now for different reasons, which we will go over in this video. And them not playing it is not necessarily the problem here, which I actually agree with. Ion went on to say that you can actually not play Mythic Plus if you instead play Delve. So essentially when they added the Delve system, they kind of expected some people to shift from doing keys to doing Delves, which is normal. I mean, you know, you have different content to play, but at least you're still playing the game. And from the dev's perspective, that's what matters. However, if people stop playing Mythic Plus because they're not fun, as opposed to having an alternative, that is indeed a problem. And the numbers definitely show that Mythic Plus hasn't been fun outside of the 10,000 videos that everybody with a YouTube account has kind of made in the last, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 months, especially since beta, for some of us content creators, of course. And it's good that they've listened. Is it too late? Well, we'll probably have to find out eventually, but what exactly is the situation of the current season of Mythic Plus? Because we actually have numbers. We actually have very good examples of how much the meta influences the dungeons, how much the dungeons influence the meta, and how all of this makes your keys a pain, makes it close to impossible for you to find a group if you're not playing the right spec. And from the developers of Radar.io and the founders and everybody that collects data there, we also have some numbers going into it. First of all, just an overall look at the dungeon representation. Currently, or at least in week 14th of the season, there are 4 times fewer keys and players, or keys I guess, being done than in the first week of the dungeon, which is a massive dropout in terms of dungeon participation and overall the content being played by the players. Of course, every season you're gonna have a drop off, and not just in Mythic Plus, but in raids and in all aspects of the game. People come in, they check it out, some of them don't find it fun, they leave, some of them finish what they want to do quicker and they still leave, so overall the player base drops a little bit. A little bit is a little bit relative, but it also is true. This time it's more than just a little bit, and we have felt it from the first week where we would find a group in like, I don't know, 5 minutes tops, to now taking 30 to 40 minutes to find a group of players that will get us in, sometimes not even ever inviting us because we're just not playing the meta spec. So that is the initial issue. Why we're here? Well, let's take a look at the meta. As we've known since I think 11.05, whenever the Prop Paladin buffs came in, it has made Prop Paladin the de facto tank for a bunch of reasons. Well, before getting to the reasons, just you need to know that right now, over 90% of the keys that are being done, they have a Prop Paladin in it. That is way more overrepresentation than we've ever had before, even in the God Comp season of Dragonflight that people have severely criticized, that only had what, Bear, Augmentation, Shadow Priest and Fire Mage, I think it was at the time. Now it's even more than that. 90% of the keys having only one tank just means that if you're not playing a tank and if you're not playing Prop Paladin, you are at a loss. And need I remind you, there are 6 tank specs, 5 of which compose of less than what, 8% of the total keys being done. That is big. That is very big. On top of that, over 40% are the same comp. So if you take the most popular comp in Mythic Plus, which according to Radar.io comprises of Prot Paladin, Discipline Priest, Red Paladin, Augmentation Evoker, and Frost Death Knight. These compose over 40% of the total keys done. This is massive considering that before, if you had a very good comp, the God comp, it would comprise at most 6% of all of the keys done. So one comp is essentially played 5 times more than ever in the past, and which will normally trickle down to the average player, where if you're not playing one of these specs, you're likely not going to get invited into the key, let alone having to wait 30-45 minutes to get into a dungeon. And we even have personal examples from, I believe, the founder of Raider.io, who went on to say that him and his buddies usually do keys and push in the range of getting their portals done, usually end up in the top 1-2% in that season in the world. Now that's close to impossible, and their usual comp is, I believe that he said, Blood Death Knight, Arms Warrior, Beast Mastery, Holy Paladin, and probably Red Paladin, something like that. And they found it close to impossible to be able to get to that range right now, and if they had to like pug keys, sayonara, no keys done for you. And that's from people that are usually in the top 1-2% in the world. That paints a picture as to where the situation with Mythic Plus is today. And of course, like I mentioned, the reasons that led up to this have been pointed out since early beta by a lot of people, us included to a lesser extent, but we've had our fair share of, oh my god, this season is not looking too good, and part of that was because tanks and healers were severely nerfed in terms of their overall gameplay and how they interacted with the combat encounters. There were insane amounts of casts that went on through the groups that needed interrupt to be able to be stopped, not just stuns or knockbacks or anything like that. The amount of casts being so exacerbatedly high meant that you would first need melees in your group and not range, because melees have faster kicks, so you overall interrupt way more, on top of you wanting a Prot Paladin right now that just interrupts non-stop and constantly, and that just creates the current meta that we have today. Not to mention that particular mechanics that exist into a dungeon, whether it is debuffs, dispels, or types of damage that you or your party takes or that is required from you, pushed Discipline Priest to be one of the top healers. And before Discipline Priest, it was Restoration Shaman that was, I think, the only healer outside of Druid, which was just very undertuned, that could dispel both poison and curses. Remember, there was a time when Poison Cleansing Totem was on a very short cooldown, and that was the time when Restoration Shaman was probably having the highest representation in terms of the healers. That was nerfed, then we moved on to Discipline Priest. Because the mechanics are so brutal and so specific, you just had to have very specific responses to them, and by nature of what that means, you would just have fewer specs being able to respond to these types of mechanics. That, with the dungeons being overtuned and the classes having a relatively shitty balance across the board, pushed very specific compositions to be the ones that actually worked, especially in the high end of keys, and that trickles down to the regular average Joes like you and I, that if you're not playing one of these specs, it's just go play something else. And the devs have recognized this being an issue. By the devs, I mean, of course, Ion Hazzikostas, which is a big thing, by the way, because they hardly ever recognize this publicly in such a deliberate way, where if the dungeons are not fun, that's indeed a problem, which is the biggest thing that Ion has said about Mythic Plus in the last couple of years, most likely. This, of course, means big things are coming for Season 2, because they normally don't say anything that they're not going to be implementing. Now, they already are working on solutions. Some of them have already been implemented, if not just data mined. First of all, we know about the keys not depleting anymore once you reach 2,850 dungeon score, IO score, or Mythic Plus score, whatever you want to call it. The keys will not drop below a +12. This is the current version of this solution, which is a shit solution, and I will tell you in a second why that is. Also, tank busters are going to be nerfed, from what Ion has said in this interview. That doesn't really say much, considering that right now we are playing a outdated version of the PTR, which is in and of itself kind of bad when you start the PTR test cycle with an already old version of The system doesn't really create the first impression that we need to make sure that Season 2 is more appealing to players, but I digress. Let's say that the tank bushes and overall tank mechanics will be nerfed, aka tanks won't take as much damage, leaving out a lot of the tank specs being unplayable in the future, and of course healers not being able to respond to certain types of damage coming into the group. Although we don't really know much about the healers at the moment if their general playstyle and gameplay will be addressed. We of course know that augmentation is going to be nerfed, which is maybe the biggest thing that happened in terms of class and spec balance, because it has been an overwhelming spec to have in dungeons, and augmentation being nerfed means a lot of things that will happen to healers. First of all, healers are overall nerfed because they need to heal more, since augmentation provided a good amount of tankiness to the entire group and was the reason why keys could be pushed so high up. Take away augmentation not being able to buff tanks and healers, and everybody will do lower keys. We don't know what lower means, 2, 3, 4 key levels below what they're currently doing, which is an overall nerf of the entire community. Meaning that in order to follow this up, you would need to also severely nerf dungeons as a baseline to account for the fact that augmentation no longer helps keep people push up. I'm not saying that they buff dungeons because people would be playing augmentation, but I'm saying that people don't like it when they cannot push very high. That just creates an unfun season. It's what we're having right now, and if you take away a reason why they were also being able to push that high, then you have to nerf the dungeons even more so that you don't have people just being stuck in +11s and 12s. And a little bit of a good news is that after we've tested the Operation Floodgate, these changes are actually placed in the design of the new dungeon, which I have had previous wrong opinions about, although you will see the full opinions on the dungeon I think tomorrow or the day after when we have our video up for that as well. But just a long story short, the dungeon has fewer casts overall and fewer mechanics overall, making it less overbearing and less stressful to actually do. Some of these mechanics, like the saw mechanics that you've seen and that you probably heard memes about, are overtuned, but that's not that big of a problem as long as they know that they don't want them to be overtuned. They can just tune it. That's just in tuning. Whenever you have 17 mechanics instead of 3, it's kind of harder to tune into the dungeon without just nerfing the mobs or taking the mobs out of the dungeon pool altogether. So the fact that it's less stressful to do Operation Floodgate is a good sign that the Season 2 will be better, and I've done it from a melee DPS, range DPS, tank, and healer perspective, and I do have to say it's way better than the dungeon pools that we've had to test prior to Season 1 being released. And it's great that their mentality is set to make Season 2 easier, more accessible, and more fun to players. However, I do think that they're still missing the mark on some of them, and it's risky to push forward some of these solutions because it feels like they're disconnected from the actual problem. Tanks and healers, first of all, need to be less punished, which we're already kind of working into that direction, but we're only really seeing the tank part. The healer is a little bit more abstract, so I'm hoping that those will be addressed as well, because one of the biggest problems for people to pug dungeons is being able to get into a group as most people would be a DPS player, which is very difficult since everybody just wants healers and tanks. Now also, once again, these need to be addressed in the perspective of augmentation not being a spec that assists you in keeping people alive or staying alive yourself. The second of all, mechanics, we know for the first dungeon that's coming in, which is Operation Floodgate, need to be nerfed drastically, and they have to be less specific, which is not something that we can say about the other 4 Door Within dungeons, which have been designed with the mentality of the Season 1, so hopefully those will be addressed in time as well. And what do I mean by specific mechanics? I mean, of course, the 10 million casts that we have been having so far in the first season that will promote Prot Paladin and melee DPS above everybody else to be able to handle all these interrupts. And of course that goes down to being able to interrupt without just using a kick. If I can stun, I want that spell to be interrupted because I used something to stop the mob from casting. That change that was added in the PTR or beta cycle for the War Within has been heavily criticized, not good, not liked by almost anybody, so we hope that actually goes away in Season 2, or as quickly as fucking possible. There are also melee unfriendly mechanics in the new dungeon, which will make it harder to actually use a melee DPS in the dungeon the higher you push, which will skew the meta towards a more ranged heavy. Once again, the more specific mechanic, the higher chance you will play a specific spec for it, the higher chance that the meta will revolve a more tightly knit choices of specs, which will again create a problem to today that people cannot get into a group if they don't play the particular spec. On top of this, balance needs to be addressed as well, balance between specs. Of course, that's always going to be a topic of discussion. Specs will never be equal in terms of power, because then we would just play one spec with different names and that would just be about it, and that would be boring. That's fine. I'm not talking about that. What I am talking about, once again, similar to mechanics, the encounters have to be less specific. That will promote a specific type of utility kit that certain specs have that other specs don't have. Stuff like poison dispels, curse dispels being required, stuff like grips being required. We want to have as few of those mechanics as possible, not zero of course, because as a DK I kind of want to feel like my grip will matter at one point. But maybe a controversial take in terms of balance and in terms of how this will affect the group composition is introducing bigger pools. From what we have seen in terms of the dungeon tuning so far is that they will continuously nerf people being able to pull bigger, and I feel like that will just create more niche and specific meta composition, since not all specs perform the same way in different AoE scenarios. Specs like Red Paladin, Fury Warrior, Frost DKs are notoriously really good in low target AoE, while specs like Unholy and Fire Mage are really good in big AoE. And you don't see the latter and you see the former because we cannot just pull very big, similar to tanks. The bigger the pools can be, the more people can actually engage with the content and be able to pool different kinds of mobs based off of different party compositions and different DPS available, essentially opening up the doors for more people to play their specs and not feel like, oh, I just cannot fight this because I just don't do damage to half of the mobs, or I only do half of my damage because we're just not pulling big enough. That is a problem that creates a strict meta. And last but not least, in terms of the solutions that they have proposed, depletion needs to be revised. Having the keys not being able to deplete once you reach 2850 score means jack shit, because that right now means it will affect less than 2% of the player base, which is who actually has this score already. This is a change requested by the entire community, and if it affects only 1 to 2% of the player base, it doesn't really solve a problem, does it? When 98% of the players will never see this change in the game. That's the first issue of this solution. The second issue of this solution is that it stops keys from going below 12, which means that the keys will still deplete. If you're doing a 14, it will still drop to a 13. And maybe this depletion will happen to all of the key levels, but if it will only stop keys going below a specific level, it will just kind of half solve this problem. And these half-ass responses and half-ass solutions are what led us to having covenants in Shadowlands, where from very strict covenants to being annoying and less annoying and less annoying, until they finally pulled the ripcord in the last patch and let us just switch covenants. It has been shown time and time again in previous season, whether it was season 3 of Dragonflight, whether it was the last season of Shadowlands or BFA, whenever they fully commit to a solution, people love it more and they play it more. Whether it's corruptions in BFA, covenants in Shadowlands, or just class representation in Dragonflight in season 3, we need to fully embrace the solution and not just cherry pick a little bit. Actually, will only affect 1% of the player base and only above keys 12s and so on. And if we're gonna address depletion, there are some big contenders and players that factor into this depletion problem. First of all is the Challenger's Peril affix, which gives us a big penalty when we die. In and of itself, this is not the problem, but then on top of this, you add the dungeon timer, which of course, these have been played with to kind of adjust for this, but still feel like the solution is not there, because once again, we're cherry picking, we're half-assing the solution. Graveyards are also a big problem. You can take away the Challenger's Peril and give a dungeon timer, be very generous, but if it takes me 30 to 45 seconds to come back to my party after I died, that's also a problem in and of itself that needs to be addressed. The balance between these systems has to be very delicate in order to not feel like it's overbearing, or take away these problems altogether with giving graveyards at every boss, at every big corner of a dungeon, and so on and so forth, especially when you have dungeons where you skip packs but you cannot go back to your party because there's a pack that you skipped that now you have to fight to get back to your group. And last but not least, another good thing about the depletion that has been addressed are the rewards. Now, that has been addressed in 1107, where we get more crests if we deplete the key than before, significantly more crests before, and we get overall more crests to begin with, solving the gearing option in the reward system. This is now. We don't know if this will continue in season 2, but it has to continue into season 2 for the season to be saved. And this is just from one interview. Is Mythic Plus saved right now? it's looking like it's going to be, but going to be and being are not the same thing at the moment. So we can only hope that more and more feedback is being provided and listened to by the devs, so we can actually have a more fun Mythic Plus environment in Season 2. And to get hyped for Season 2, you should look at the tier lists that we have, because they might need some solving as well.